G'day, I'm Owen, you've joined the pub test, and in this one we are continuing our Jack the Ripper suspect series, and we're looking at a bloke, Willy Clarkson. Who was he, and how does he fit into the Jack the Ripper saga? Well, let's put it to the pub test. Well, Willy Clarkson was born in 1861, and he either lived or had his businesses centered around a 2-mile radius from where these crimes were committed. And yes, he definitely was a Londoner. Now, his father was a wig maker and must have been doing all right for himself because he was able to send Willy off to Paris for education. But at the age of 12, not sure exactly whether it was scholastic ability he was struggling with or whether his father really needed a hand in the business, possibly because of failing health. Don't know, but he comes back to London and starts working in the business, which did happen to be rather fortuitous because in 1878 his father did pass away. So at the young age of 17, Willy Clarkson takes over this wig-making business. But he showed a fair bit of entrepreneurial skill because he expanded it out from just making wigs to costumes and makeup. Now this business and Willy himself became quite prominent because it was said that no London theatre was done without his costumes. Now, costumes were a very important part of theatre back then because it was all live acting, and the actors would play numerous parts. So in between scenes, they would have to get dressed up differently. And it said that Willy Clarkson or his employees would be there to help them get in and out of their different costumes and wigs. So it's safe to say he had quite the reputation in the area, particularly in the theatre. And we're going to look at that reputation a little bit further because he went really high up. It was very, very well known. But as stated, in 1888, he was living within 2 miles where all the crimes were committed. But just a couple of intriguing things as regards what he did in the business. Now, in World War I, it said that he made papier-mâché heads to give to the British Army. And so when they were in the trenches, they'd stick these heads up just out of the trench on a bit of a stick, and then it would be the German snipers, I believe, would see them, and they were so lifelike, the snipers would take a shot. And when the papier-mâché head got hit, they'd pull it down, be able to check the direction of the bullet to know where the snipers were hiding. So he must have been very, very good at that particular endeavour as well. But there was a very intriguing little bit of deceit he performed, which became quite well known, and it was the Dreadnaught Hoax. Now, this happened before World War I in 1910, and one of the perpetrators involved in this little bit of a hoax was Virginia Woolf, the writer, though she wasn't Woolf at the time. But what happened was they got 4 or 5 people, dressed them up like they were Abyssinian royals, so they've come from the Middle East, and they're going to get a tour of this battleship, the Dreadnaught. And they do. They get accepted as this royal family from the Middle East, get this full tour of this warship. And when you see they had to have their skin darkened, Virginia herself had to look like a bloke. They dressed them up in the wigs and the costumes, and it all came from Willy Clarkson's handiwork. Now, you would say, well, that was back then. That type of thing could not possibly happen today at all. Surely. Well, a very odd thing happened in 2007 where a group of blokes known as the Chasers, and they had a TV show called The Chasers War on Everything was the show they were doing at the time. And remembering the Twin Tower attack in the United States happened in 2001, and Osama bin Laden passed away in 2011. So in 2007, he was still one of the most wanted men in the world. So the chasers thought, when an APEC meeting was happening in Australia, where lots of these heads of states are getting together, including the President of the United States, who was George Bush at the time. So George Bush is in Australia, and these blokes decide to get a limo in the cavalcade with one of them dressed up as Osama bin Laden. And they had their little fake badges. Even the badge said, this is obviously a fake badge. The plan to this particular little skit was that they would get to the first police checkpoint and they'd be told, look, yeah, tell it while you're walking, buddies. Really funny. I'm going to get to see myself on TV, but you're not getting any further. But they got through. And they kept getting through the different security to the point where the chasers themselves started to think, this has gone too far. If the President of the United States here, he's probably got his Secret Service detail, and we're going to be in a lot of trouble and maybe even get shot. And so they then tried to turn the limo around whilst they were in the cavalcade, and that's when security thought, that's really odd, and they jumped on the car, dragged him out, they got arrested, the charges eventually got dropped. But my point being is, it's quite surprising what you can get away with if, one, you have the confidence, and two, you can dress yourself up a little bit. Everyone thinks these buildings and big events where heads of state get together are safe and secure, but I'll tell you, you'd be surprised how easy it is to slip past security. And I think that is important to state here as we move forward with Willy Clarkson. But just getting back to Willy Clarkson himself and his business, yes, he did sell a lot to the theatres, but he also advertised, I've got plenty of stuff for the common folk as well, including second-hand wigs. If you don't have too much money, I can still look after you. Bring in your cash and you can walk out with a wig. So these things would have been around quite everywhere, because apparently it was the thing. Because you'd put on a wig. I don't know how I'd look with a wig. Let me know. Do you think I should get one? Now, if you wanted to hide, you'd probably have a bit of Willy Clarkson's gear. Husbands would put on some stuff to go follow the wife around to see if she may have been seeing other people. Perhaps wives did the same with husbands, but it was only really reported about husbands doing it to wives because blokes basically back then could do whatever they wanted, really. I don't think with too much consequence, as we've seen with a few of these poor women and the situations that they had to put up with. And also some blokes put on the gear it was said, to see how the other side lived. They'd go down to the East End of London there just to basically be a tourist and have a bit of a sticky beak around. I think it's probably safe to say a few of them may have wore the gear to go and partake of certain activities that were happening in the East End without being recognised by people, which I think is more likely than just going down to have a look. In 1888, the police were using these disguises to try and, one, pretend to be a woman to attract Jack the Ripper and catch him. That created quite a few embarrassing scenes because the police actually had a certain minimum height to be a policeman. And it was normally a lot taller than the average female at the time. So they sort of stuck out a little bit. Long Liz, Elizabeth Stride, would have been the one difference there. But as a general rule, it was known that some of these tall women walking around were policemen, and it caused a couple of scuffles with the public. But it wasn't just the police. The journalists also were putting on costumes to go out and see if they also couldn't catch Jack the Ripper as well. Because could you imagine the papers and prominence and money you would have made if you were the journalist that caught Jack the Ripper? So these blokes were out there taking all those risks for that fame and fortune. But it's also said that it was medical students as well going out dressed up in all this different gear as well, so that they too could apprehend Jack the Ripper for whatever reason. I really don't know why. Maybe they didn't like the fact that the papers were saying it could be a medical person. So they wanted to catch him to prove it wasn't them. It wasn't these medical students running around committing these crimes. But regardless, Willy Clarkson's attire was being used by a wide variety of people during that Autumn of Terror. And for this reason, this is where the theory about Willy Clarkson himself being Jack the Ripper comes in. Now, knowing he would have only been around 27 years old. So I know many people say age is important. Well, he would fit that bill. But he would have been able to dress himself up and disguise himself. Now, it was highlighted particularly one crime scene, and that was with Catherine Eddowes at Mitre Square. Now, when we slow that one down and take another look at the particular details, it's absolutely staggering how the person who perpetrated that crime was not seen, heard, or caught. And so the suggestion is that they were able just to blend in somehow and disappear. Now, if you remember, it was P.C. Watkins who entered Mitre Square, he says, at 1:44 a.m. And he entered Mitre Square from off Mitre Street itself. But P.C. Harvey, who was also in that area but on a slightly different beat, was near the other entrance to Mitre Square at 1:42 a.m. So only a 2-minute difference. Now, if Jack the Ripper had have been where that body was found just 2 minutes prior, he would have gone out the other way and would have run into P.C. Harvey. It's also mentioned that P.C. Pierce was living there in Mitre Square itself. He also didn't see or hear a thing, but he could have been very well much asleep. But there's one other little detail which I just did not know, and I only stumbled upon this very, very recently. And it makes sense of why P.C. Watkins went to the warehouse instead of knocking on P.C. Pierce's door. So he went to George Morris, who he knew was awake and who was up. But it said that George Morris used to be a police officer. And P.C. Watkins had been on the force for quite some time, so he probably knew George Morris from the police force. And so now all of a sudden, rather than just going to some random bloke working in the warehouse, it actually makes sense why he would go to a former police officer for help. So I may need to reconsider some of the comments I made about P.C. Watkins, because it doesn't paint him in such a bad light as was suggested maybe in one of those previous videos. But he also, George Morris, had that door open to the warehouse. He could see Mitre Square. He did not see anything or anyone or hear anything. And we're talking a crime, therefore had the window of opportunity of not 15 minutes from the last time P.C. Watkins patrolled Mitre Square, but possibly only 13 minutes, because P.C. Harvey was at the other entrance 2 minutes prior to 1:44. But regardless, how could that bloke get someone in there, perform the crimes, which up to that point was the very worst crime done, until a month later with Mary Kelly, and just disappear? Now, I know, and this does raise a question here, and trust me, I hear it. It doesn't matter whether you were dressed up in a costume or not. No one saw anybody. So it's not that Willy Clarkson had the wig of invisibility. He could bang that on his head and then no one could see him at all. So I think the disguise, though, goes more to the fact that he was able to get out of Mitre Square and not have attention drawn to himself, because he could just mingle in with the mob. So despite the fact of being able to make disguises and being able to obviously know how to take them off and on very quickly, what motive would he have had to perform these crimes? Well, there's an interesting link. There was a bloke by the name of Hobbs who in 1886 was working at a solicitor's firm not far away from where Clarkson's office was as well, and they got to know each other. But now, Hobbs himself was a man of dubious character. It was said in 1921, a Maharaja, or at least he was going to be the Maharaja, Hari Singh, came out to England to visit a high-end escort, and Hobbs got to know about it. And so he blackmailed Mr. Singh for a ridiculous amount of money. It's reportedly said £300,000, which back in those days was just ridiculous. Now, whether that figure is true or not, I cannot be 100% certain. But it was known that the authorities got wind of this. Hobbs is on the run. He's just about to leave England and they catch him before he leaves, and he's got £1,500 on him, which also at the time was a ridiculous amount of money. Not the $300,000, but they said, you've got this money, so we know you extorted someone. But guess who turned up to help him? It was Willy Clarkson. And he actually produced a deed saying, I gave Hobbo this money, so you can just let him go. He was carrying it for me. And so they do. They let him out. Now, Hobbs got himself into other trouble and didn't end up in prison here and there, but the question is, how did Hobbs find out about this dalliance between Singh and this lady? Well, it's suggested that maybe it was the woman that gave the information to Hobbs so he could do the blackmail and she would get paid as well. And the suggestion is that's what they were doing in 1888. They were hiring some of these women to point out some prominent people they may have had a business transaction with. They would extort them for money in return for a commission. But it's said, now this particular theorist's idea says that Martha Tabram was the first Ripper victim. Now I know that is disputed, but that's really not the point here. But it's said that it was only 2 days prior to Martha Tabram's crime that Willy Clarkson had a big write-up in the paper. So the English Telegraph had run this huge story about him, and it was in that year that he'd become the wig maker for the royal family. And the article was talking about how wealthy he was, how prominent he was. And it suggested then that Martha saw this article and said, well, you're not paying me enough. And so she tried to blackmail them, Hobbs and Clarkson, and said, if you don't give me the money, I'm going to spill the beans. And then he will lose all this prominence and possibly all this wealth that he has acquired. So what does he do? He has to go around and silence the victim. You might say, well, that seems a bit of a stretch, but there was something stated in his biography. Now, his biography was started while he was alive, but was finished after he passed away by someone who apparently knew him very well. And it was said that in Dutfield's yard, where Elizabeth Stride was found, that a wig was also found in that yard. And the police, and this is written in the biography, the police went and visited his shop and said, look, we found this wig. We need to see the receipt. We want to know the bloke who bought it, because then we will find who Jack the Ripper was, because he's obviously dropped the wig. And he could not find a receipt for that particular wig. But the police don't really think much of it at the time, but it suggested he did not have a receipt for that because he never sold it. That was one of his. And I would just throw out something here too. If wigs were that prolific and that sought after, I'd suggest that a marine trader here or there might actually have access to a bit of this costume stuff as well. So Edward Buchan may have had a few of the things in his shop ready to go and throw on and go out and perform the crimes. Check out that video if you haven't watched the last one that came out. But I do have to state here that there is no concrete evidence that a wig was ever found. In fact, in seeing this particular theory was the first time I'd ever heard of a wig found in Dutfield's yard. And just because it's in a biography written, or I should say finished, after the bloke passed away, may just cast a bit of doubt about the veracity of a wig being found. But unfortunately, a lot of records have been lost, so there's no definitive proof that that event didn't happen. But what if he have had the skill, Willy Clarkson himself, to commit these crimes? Well, interestingly, his grandfather was a barber surgeon. And it's said that Clarkson still had the knives and the anatomy books that his grandfather had passed down. And so he could have learnt all about that and definitely had access to the tools. So do you think it passes the pub test? He was in the area. He had access to anatomy books and the tools. And the motive could have been to silence those people who were trying to blackmail him and ruin his reputation, even though he was doing the blackmailing himself. I have my doubts. I just don't see it, primarily because he was so very, very well known. I don't think his staff would have not got wind of the fact if he wasn't out and about most nights and not turning up to work the next morning. It's not to say that Willy Clarkson himself, though, was an upstanding individual. In fact, he got himself involved in fraud, insurance fraud. He had quite a few fires in his shops over time, and some very expensive things got burnt. Apparently, though, it was later pointed out that a lot of these storerooms were emptied the day before the fire, but he was claiming lots of money from the insurance companies. Which is important because the insurance companies didn't like that. And when he passed away, they actually had their hand out to get a lot of that money back. Because someone had come forwards saying, yes, these were all con jobs. But Hobbs produced a will showing that he was the sole beneficiary of the fortune of Willy Clarkson. And it was considered to be a large, large fortune. That will got contested by some relatives of Clarkson, and the relatives won. But after the insurance company took their money back, there was nothing left. Somewhere or somehow, this fortune had disappeared, because the money the insurance companies were after wasn't all the money. But now it's gone. So what happened to it? Well, that remains a mystery. So whilst I don't think Clarkson himself is Jack the Ripper, I do think it raises a very intriguing thing that I myself haven't fully gone down the path of or considered yet. But could the perpetrator of the crimes been dressing themselves up, hiding who they were very, very well? So these eyewitness reports now we have to look at differently, I believe. But what do you think? Do you think someone could have been getting around in a disguise? And in the next video, we will be looking at someone who did use disguises. And that is also a very intriguing suspect. But let me know what you think. Whilst I personally do not think he's a highly credible suspect, I do think those couple of details, the motive of blackmail, That's intriguing and possibly needs to be looked into, and the fact someone could have been walking around dressed up, hiding who they were. Might just change the thought on a couple of suspects, in my mind. But thank you very much for watching. It genuinely is appreciated. Thank you to all who are sharing these videos. And if you want to, give us a like, give us a subscribe. I'm Owen, you've been watching The Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.